Welcome to the Common Mission Project podcast series. Joining me today, as always, is my co-host Rodrigo. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Hi Jim, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well. Having a great time. Now the sun is shining in California. Finally, after all of our biblical rains that we have, so we're very happy again. So
No, it's good to see you. So this is our first podcast where we're actually doing video with this. So those who have been listening or those who are new, you can actually see us and be able to put a face to the voice. So we're glad to have you on this episode
and
as we break into season 2.
Yeah, and more than seeing us, which is nice, and it always gives you some information about the person that you are interacting with, even if it's mediated by technology. It's also a way for us to expand our platforms and be able to reach you guys in different places. We're hoping that by adding video and being able to be on YouTube, we will be simplifying access to the content that the Common Mission Project puts out for you guys.
Absolutely, yeah. So definitely more to come with this medium. We'll have live streaming events, bringing our academic advisory board and different colleagues and co-hosts, and hopefully, as you've already listened to before you got to this episode, is our session with Pete Newell, the CEO of BMNT. So a lot of exciting things that we've got queued up for this next season, and one of the things that I think as academics, as faculty members, as people who are working in the technology ecosystem, Rodrigo, is we've talked a lot about disruptive innovation. And it's something we talk a lot about in H4 just in general. I think H4 is very disruptive at its core. And that's why it's been such a successful platform that we've employed in the classroom and beyond. But we've seen just in the last couple of months, I would say in some ways, a paradigm shift with the way that we're interacting with technology, just even in the classroom. So, it's not that far away. And, Rodrigo, you and I went through school where this was kind of bifurcated as textbooks, encyclopedias, being in the library, doing hands-on physical research, to now where the world is quite literally available at your fingertips. And something that has been a recent change that we've been seeing is the OpenAI chatbot generator. And this is something that is another, in my opinion, and Rodrigo, I think yours as well, is a paradigm shift in what we experience in our day-to-day lives. Is that a kind of fair assessment?
I think so. I mean, we're having this Kitty Hawk moment, right? This moment in which something we thought would be either impossible or very hard or late into the future just hit us right in the face, kind of in the mid of December, if I remember correctly,
Right.
when OpenAI, this startup company, well, I think they're still a non-for-profit, but this
I believe
startup
so.
organization, they're working to create artificial intelligence applications, release their ChatGPT model to the world. And there's a lot of things to discuss for listeners who are in academia, but also for everybody interested in innovation in general. There's a very meta component of the disruption that I think it would be nice to talk about, Jim, which is how this reflects the dynamics that we often talk about in Lean and in Hacking for Defense, the way this was released, etc. But at the same time, it's also an element that is transforming the way we conceive education, and it's releasing a lot of fears into the environment. So I think there's a lot of good layers that OpenAI, ChatGPT technologies allows us to talk about today. So.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really valuable point. So, you're right. It's from an academic perspective, I think just in technology in general, as we're seeing these shifts happen every year, every month, whatever it may look like, is that, as faculty members, for example, we have a couple of different ways we can go with the approach to these technologies. And I think obviously there's a different but related way that we react in industry or in our day-to-day lives. And I think these are the interesting points that we can kind of talk about in some way about disruptive innovation.
Yeah, and if you don't know what ChatGPT is, what have you been doing, right? But just for the few of those who might not know, so GPT, what is GPT-3? They're actually 3.5 model right now. It's a generative AI model, and many other podcasts, many other people with a with an IT background and artificial intelligence and big data would be much better at explaining the how does it work under the hood. But what matters for us is that it's a generative language semantic model that it's able to replicate a human conversation from a very basic sets of prompts. And what OpenAI did with this Chat GPT is that they optimized a model our listeners who know Lean will identify. They created a single feature MVP, let's say, where they took the generative model that they had, gave it a very basic interface, a chatbot interface, and released it to the world for free, right? In what it's basically a getting out of the building and learning what people would do with this generative model. And it took the world by surprise, even though the technology is not that new. The GPT model that is being used has been available for a while. The creation of a user interface that was simple, and then the fact that it's free and everybody could use, suddenly gave us this kind of glimpse of the future of how this AI thing that we've been talking about since the Jetsons, right? Suddenly was hitting us in the face, and it was becoming real. And there's this tectonic shift in a lot of industries, and I would say academia in particular had a hard time, or is having a hard time, processing the meaning of this new technology.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on this and get into a couple of other topics here, but it's one of those things where there's as academics, as faculty, you have options, right? I remember when we went through school, Rodrigo, it wasn't an uncommon thing for us to say, you have to learn how to do this because you never have a calculator in your pocket all the time. Well,
we
do. You do now. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have to know how to do things to make the calculation correct. There's a level of that. But you do carry a calculator in your pocket. I mean, gosh, you carry basically everything in there. So the reality is that technology continues to shift the way we do things. And if we don't look at ways that we can empower users, our students, if we're talking about academia, to utilize these tools in smart ways, they're going to do it anyway, right? So if we look at this particular piece of technology, is it plagiarism in the traditional sense? Because are they copying something from somebody else? Well, the answer is no, right?
Yeah, and this is where the conversation starts to become interesting, right? So first of all, what happens? Myself, like many others, I went and got an account and started playing with it, right? And as an academic, what you discovered, what people started doing at the beginning is very interesting, because we're seeing this adoption curve. For anybody who's familiar with the technology adoption curve by Rogers, so the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, the laggards. So some of us immediately went and jumped into this bandwagon, started playing with it. At the beginning, people started asking single questions for single answers, right? Which is not what this model is adapted for. And little by little, we discovered what this thing is really cool about is to start having a conversation, to bounce ideas to the AI. And you're right. So one of the things the first things I did is that I used it after a while to write a essay on Vladimir Putin's geopolitical options in Ukraine, right? And our listeners should know that this model was trained by OpenAI until, I think, mid 2021. So it doesn't know. It's not in its data set to know that Russia invaded Ukraine.
Right. So it has to feed off of something, right? That's
correct.
The premise of these machine learning tools is there has to be data sets to reference back. Right. Okay.
And this goes to the copyright question that you were asking. So I take this essay, and it takes me a few hours. Right? I'm bouncing ideas. So you ask the AI, hey, write an essay. Give me an outline, refine this paragraph. This idea is good. Expand it. Kind of, it's like having a ghostwriter. It's still you who's directing it, you're prompting it, that's the term, but now it's doing the mechanics of the writing and expanding and taking data, etc. Well, to make a long story short, I take this paper and I ask a friend who's an expert in the post-Soviet space. Say, hey, I got this comp, and I'm sorry if he's listening, but I said, I got this comp. Would you help me grade it? Right. So what grade would you give it? So, well, show me the rubric that you use to grade your comps. I said, sure, here it is. And he said, well, I think it's an A- or a B+. I said, good. So you just gave an A- to a artificial intelligence generator. Now, I still had a lot of intervention in doing it.
It wasn't just plug and done. You had to put some effort in here. Right.
but that's the fear, right? And
Hmm.
immediately publications start to emerge in both in the general public press, but also in the Chronicle. And so is the university essay dead, right? So is this the end of the world for writing skills? Some universities, I won't say now, I think University of Sydney at one point are even going back to pen and paper, so students cannot use it. So there's this kind of antibody reaction that we identify for anybody who has read the history of scientific revolutions, right? So
Hmm.
the shape. There is this antibody reaction of the established paradigm against the ChatGPT in particular, and the idea of AI, and that's kind
Right.
of where we carry into the beginning of the year, is with this fear of academics feeling that many of them, that their job had been now transformed and they had this cheating tool that they had to fight. And I will challenge that lens, but that's where we enter the year, with this original fear by academia regarding ChatGPT in particular.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that you're bringing up, and one that uh, what and I think it almost falls flies in the face of what does it mean to the college experience? What does it mean to be a college student? And that's the thing, is that in my opinion, and I don't want to speak for you, Rodrigo, but in part of the way is that we are preparing our students to be a good critical thinkers, but b to be prepared to be participating in the workforce, right? And if we're saying whatever it is that you can't use these tools, well, what happens when there's prohibition? And we can look back at history in a lot of different ways. What happens when you say somebody can't? It doesn't stop it. uh, and it means that we're not preparing our students necessarily in the ways that they have to be responsive and
That's the most
attentive to the
important
changed
part.
landscape, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So as some universities start to literally try to ban, I think NYU at one point, I don't know if they're still doing it. They ban it from NYU computer systems, and they start to treat it as plagiarism. So if students are using it, and I mean, this is a few months. We're really
Right.
talking, as I said, is the Wright brothers just flew the plane, right? So
Right.
it's very early
Hmm.
for everybody who had not access to advanced accounts that used to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And at this very moment, where some universities are just banning it and sounding the alarm, somebody is finding a business model for
Of
it, right?
course.
And then the question becomes what you're saying. Don't we want to prepare our students with this new tool that is now part of their world to be effective at it? And this is where some of the counter reaction comes. And you start to have universities, USC, for example, that sends a letter at the beginning of the semester saying, hey, professors, as much as you can, incorporate the technology into
Hmm.
your teachings. First of all, learn about it, get your
Right.
account, play with it, and don't fight it. And this is a judo move, right? So integrate it into what you do. And if it turns out that the essay as we know it is going to be transformed by it, well, so be it,
So be
right?
it.
Learn
Absolutely.
how to live in that new contextual world. And that's kind of the first tension that we see in academia. Jim, I don't know if you agree, between
Yeah. Yeah.
those who went with the Luddite approach of ban the damn thing, get it away, don't install it in the computers, and then I think what it's a more reasonable option, which is embrace the existence of the technology, learn about it, and incorporate it into the teaching experience and make it a tool of learning critical thinking, as we incorporated the Excel spreadsheet, the calculator, or the spell checker, right?
Yeah, and and that's the exact right point. Is as we were preparing for this episode in our discussions, is spell checking plagiarism and all these things, like, as we see technology, but they become so ubiquitous and so accepted that they're tools to enhance the student experience and to make us that much better in preparing our students what they're going to be focusing in. And I think there's I'm going to try my best not to ruffle a lot of feathers or anything, but I think the reality is that the status quo, well, and we've always done it that way, is why empires fall, right? If you're not constantly innovating and constantly looking for disruption and being the disruption in a space, whether it's technology, education, module or pedagogical approaches, anything, you're going to fall by the wayside. And I think that's where, Rodrigo, you and I agree with this, is that there has to be a concerted effort to incorporate these new technologies and new approaches to things, but do so in a way that empowers the student experience, empowers the faculty experience to learn and do more, while also accepting the reality of the situation that these technologies are here, they're being used, and they're going to be used. So you've got really one option here, I think, is to embrace or find ways to work with it versus stonewalling it.
When CGI, sorry, Photoshop started to be a thing, a lot of photographers worried that the world of photography as they knew was over,
Oh
and in
yeah.
a way they were right, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Photoshop and digital artistry has in many ways replaced what used to be mechanical or physical abilities. I was watching with my kid the other day and introducing him to Star Wars first, right? And we were watching the very first, the episode 4, but the very first movie film,
Mm-hmm.
and he immediately commented how weird that I don't remember exactly the word he used, the special effects looked. He's 7 years old, so he has grown in a world in which most of the movies that he has watched are CGI, right, computer
Yeah.
generated images, and the art of the maquette and the little stop animation that used to be what Hollywood was known for had to transform into what is now a very robust and effective industry where kids are coming out of college with digital arts skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't stop the technology or track record of stopping the diffusion of an effective innovation is really bad.
Yeah.
And there is already examples of kids using the generative AI for graphics. So graphic designers, for example,
Right.
that are, so DALI, which also comes from OpenAI, but we have Stable Diffusion, Midjourney. You might have heard those came
Mm-hmm.
out kind of in October or September of
Yeah, it's
2022.
still relatively new technologies, right?
Yeah, and it's some of the same logic behind it, right? Surprisingly, the text-based one was much more disruptive than the graphic one on the side heist of the community.
Right.
But
Interestingly enough.
you, yeah, I know. I would have thought the opposite, that a computer that can paint would have been more radical than a computer that can write. But
Right.
that was not the case. And what we saw immediately was many graphic designers saying that their job was finished,
Mm-hmm.
while others, they started embracing the technology and now are producing amazing products that are AI assisted, right? So
AI
there is this
assisted, right?
challenge between adaptation and rejection. And historically, and this is something that I would say to all of us who teach innovation or are interested in entrepreneurship, those who get to approach a platform first get an incumbent advantage, right? These are the Facebooks or the world, the Googles. Those who get the technology refined early have an advantage. And there's a lot of bright minds in America, but also in our near peer competitors, thinking right now how these incredible technologies can be leveraged to create amazing new business models or to create national security and defense advantages against their adversaries.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of combine a couple of little different areas here. So, in preparation for the episode, we, Rodrigo really brought a couple of great resources here, and one of them, so is, and we kind of skipped over this, but what is disruptive innovation? And Clayton Christensen, great resource here, and I'll just read very quickly. Is what is disruption? Disruption describes a process whereby a smaller company with fewer resources is able to successfully challenge established incumbent businesses. Specifically, as incumbents focus on improving their products and services for their most demanding and usually most profitable customers, they exceed the needs of some segments and ignore the needs of others. Now, the build into the next thing that you just touched on, Rodrigo, I think is very important here is something that Christensen also said is disruptors often build business models that are very different from those of incumbents. So it's a very interesting paradigm here that we're seeing with what is disruption and what are we experiencing in our own daily lives. And I think that it's almost we maybe as consumers, general consumers, don't necessarily appreciate just how much disruption is happening or how it's happening, maybe because a large company buys the work or just how we're introduced to it. But that's where you're seeing that. And this is where I think the H4, and if you listened to our previous episode with Pete, you hear him say as well, is that if you keep doing things the way that you've always done them, and whether that's your bureaucratic processes in a government for innovation and entrepreneurship, or just the way that we teach things in academia, or just the product that you're building, somebody else is already looking at different methods of being able to get the consumers that you've been ignoring for whatever reason. Solution domains, problem domains, all these different things are all rooted in that same spot where if you stand still, it's the Red Queen problem that I know our listeners are familiar with. If you're running, somebody's going to run twice as fast to get past you. And that's just the reality of the world we live in. And these new tools we're seeing are exactly reflective of that reality, I think.
Yeah, and Christensen's findings are even worse than that. They're almost a horror story for good management, in the sense that the same skill set that makes you good and gets you to the top of your food chain are the same reasons why you have barriers to exit that you don't want to cross, right? So if you are Kodak, right, this is a typical example in the modern times. You are the best biochemical company on the planet. You're producing these nanoparticles since the beginning of the 20th. You're doing amazing work. Well, because of that, you build a skill set for our listeners from the canvas. It will be the key activities that the whole organizational cultural build are built around chemical engineering. So one engineer from the basement of your laboratories invents digital technologies. They invented them.
Kodak did.
Goes
That's
to right there where you are, Jim, right?
I am in
the
Rochester,
penthouse
New York.
of Rochester, right? And says to the board of directors, look at this amazing tech. And the organization doesn't know how to process it. That's where a lot of academic departments are right now. They're being shown the future of essay composition and AI-assisted copy editing, and they're just paralyzed with fear. Not everybody, and I'm hoping most of our listeners will be in a different part, but for many people who have been great professors teaching students how to write at the academic level in a certain way for the last 30 years, this technology feels also like a horror story.
Absolutely. And I think, and that's where, if Kodak's a great example, right? And again, as Rodrigo mentioned, it literally in my backyard. I'm from Rochester. And it's one of those things where, you look at, I don't know if people appreciate just the fact that digital imaging was created there, but Kodak did not have a way of being able to pivot the business in such a way and thought, we're going to dismiss this. It's not going to be something that's going to happen. People aren't going to adopt this. And look what happened to Kodak, right? Now, there's a lot of good things that have happened by this, but Kodak had to, at some point, they dissolved a lot of things. They sold off pieces of the company. And even though there's still a thriving film industry and there's still a need for the things that they're doing, is that if you're not built in such a way to be agile, somebody else is. And it could be somebody within your own organization. So, one of the things that Rodrigo, you didn't mention, but as we see it in academia, is that there's incredible ideas and incredible work that's going on in universities, but the IP goes to a basement and dies, and it's not helping anything. Well, this is kind of the same idea here, is that if you're an organization who is looking at things maybe from the healthcare industry, the Da Vinci surgical machine, right? So they've got a patent on this device. It's going to expire soon, or already has. And so as soon as that patent expires, there's going to be competitors that are going to come in that have been working on this. Now, if Da Vinci has been working while that patent was still protecting their IP for 20 years, and they can be 20 years ahead of anybody else because they're doing the discovery, they're not sitting on their laurels, that's great. But if they, for whatever reason, don't think that somebody's going to come and eat their lunch, well, they are. And that's where you see the Xeroxes and the Kodaks and a lot of these other organizations that they stagnate because they are not willing to be disruptive, and they don't want to be disrupted until it's kind of like an IT event. You don't if you have a ransomware attack on your systems, you don't have a proper backups and all these different things. Why did it take this event for you to realize that you needed to put the appropriate investments in place? We see this everywhere. It's not just in disruptive technology. It's just the reality that there is no more status quo. It just doesn't exist the way it used to.
Yeah, and I agree, for example, that this technology feels different because it's different, right? We've been living with the promise of AI for forever. I mean, it's been the dream of science fiction since science fiction, the automaton, right? The animated object that acts like, I mean, we encounter it in the Bible, right? So the idea of the golem, right? This concept of a machine that thinks, right? But precisely because we've lived with it for so long, we dismissed it as fantasy, right? It lives in the realm of the Lord of the Rings, not in the realm of things happening. In the meantime, we've been chopping at what used to be things that only humans could do, right? And
Yep.
creating automation more and more.
Hmm.
But it's always been in this kind of piecemeal approach. What ChatGPT did that others haven't is that it brought it to the general purpose space that we all occupy, and it did it for free in what is
For
a very
free.
interesting getting out of the
Hmm.
building experiment, right? So
Right.
we'll talk about that later. So suddenly, this AI-like thing that can talk to you and respond like a copy editor or a friend that you're chatting with it was real. It's not anymore C-3PO again from Star Wars. I guess that
Yeah.
it's in my so it's a real thing that you can interact, and people start to realize that they're not prepared for it, and the technology is already there. And when I say that we're having a kitty hawk moment, I kind of mean it, right? So the first
Absolutely.
flight of the Wright brothers was only a few feet and just for a few seconds. Well, ChatGPT 3.5, which is what we have right now, it's a kitty hawk. This is not the end. This is the
Hmm.
beginning. This is a
Beginning.
very alpha version of what is going to be 20 years of radical advances in AI technology with semantic capabilities. Computers
Right.
we can talk to the way you and I talk with each other.
Hmm.
And boy, that kind of created a tectonic shift in a lot of places where we produce words, right? Like academia, where sometimes
Hmm.
the output is an essay, a paper, a thesis, and we're still there. We're in the shock moment, and I hope we can get fast out of it, and we can start to get the embrace and move towards integrating these more effectively in the stuff we do.
Right. And I think that's in terms of this is where, the kind of pivot us back to the hacking for framework a little bit and lean launchpad and the things that, Rodrigo, that you and I do in some ways in our academic lives. But, this is where I think we have this tremendous opportunity to look at these as these problem domains that are felt everywhere. And
Yep.
by being able to see what are these value propositions that really exist with ChatGPT, and I think that could be an episode of it in of itself. But also, how is this helping underserved customers to a point that you had made previously? So, I think moving into these pieces here is that uh, our last topic really was that nations are affected by disruption, right? I mean, in so many different ways. So we can go and talk a little bit about that, but the question too that comes out of this is the hacking for model disruptive? And I think this is an interesting way to kind of close out the conversation here, Rodrigo. Is we know, and if you look at what's happening from rapid adoption of technologies at different countries. You look at places where, in China, for example, there's the bureaucracy to get these technologies into the hands of the military it feels like, and in practice is much easier than we say in the United States. So you see where the hacking forward platform, I think, becomes such a powerful mechanism. Even our iCore platforms that we have for entrepreneurship become so powerful because what's the art of the possible? Because if you're not beholden to a certain type of bureaucracy, or that you have what the funding cycles look like, at least at its infancy, you can come up with really interesting ideas based on understanding the problem in a really full way. And this is something that I think is societally we get wrong so often, right? People innovate something, well, this is innovation, and then it fails. Well, why did it fail? Because it wasn't a problem that people actually would spend their money on. Whereas you can think of something being perhaps a dumb idea, and it becomes pet rock is going back in time. Was it a bad idea or a good idea? Well, he made millions off of it. You can make the argument he went to some beach in California, grabbed rocks, and was selling them for $15 a pop, and people bought them. Is it a dumb idea? Well, I guess not, right? Because it made the person very wealthy. So these are the kind of things where you have to let your customers tell you what's stupid or not before we can formulate these decisions in some ways.
Yeah, I think that as the technology has been diffusing, and a boy it has diffused fast, right? If you have seen some of the charts of how fast we ChatGPT reached 1 million users and then the 10 million, and it moved way faster than most of the social media companies that we are associated with
Mm-hmm.
rapid growth and scale, right? So we have seen, I think, a few pain points, to use the language that our listeners will be familiar with, that are being part of the conversation. And the first one, I won't say more about it because we already discussed it, but it's kind of this academic fear of the replacement of labor, right? And
Right.
and is our students just going to outsource their brains to ChatGPT? And well, this requires an adaptation of the kind of work that we do. But you're right. So one of the things that disruptive innovation does is that it provides services to underserved customers, right? Now we all have a graduate writing center at our disposal. We all have a shadow or a ghostwriter, the same way high performing politicians or have, right? What would you
Right.
do with it, right? It commoditizes the access to a good copy editing, right? And
Right.
good research, decent research.
Mhm.
The second one, and I don't know if you've heard about it, certainly many of our listeners will recognize the idea of ChatGPT makes mistakes, right?
Yes.
So it makes a lot of them, and it's a different kind of computer. Somebody described it to me, well, it's like a computer, it's computing for poets, right? So far we have Excel spreadsheets and mathematical formulas and Python for coding. And that was a very traditional structured thinking way of interacting with the computer. Now,
Right.
it's still very mathematical under the hood, but the way the humans experience it, it's much more artistic, right? It's
Right,
a
absolutely.
different ways of experiencing computing thinking. So it does make mistakes.
Yep.
Again, I would say it's a Kitty Hawk moment. This is the beginning, right? So the first airplane by the Wright brothers was not particularly good at flying, right?
No,
So
not at
things
all.
will get better, right? So that's
Yep.
the second pain point that I think is important. You
Absolutely.
mentioned kind of elements of the third one, which is it's not ending creative thinking. A lot of people thought it
No.
would or are afraid.
No.
It's giving you tools to be creative in ways you couldn't before. And the question is the entrepreneurship question is, what will creative people do with it, right?
Exactly.
And it will make certain things obsolete because technology often does that.
Yeah. I think you're spot on. I think you see this. You're mentioning art earlier. I have a good friend of mine who's a really great artist, and what these tools have done for him is enhanced his creative abilities, and it's been impressive. He'll send me a drawing, and then a couple hours later, he's like, "Hey, I ran it through and did some things with it. Like look how neat this was by taking these different elements of the drawings, and I was able to build this out." Or, if you're watching this, you can see in my office space here, my guitars, like technology. Whether it's auto tune, recording digitally, and being able to kind of piece things together. There are things that were happening that you can do at scale or do without having a great deal of experience that you couldn't do before, but it doesn't preclude you from needing to have some type of creative input to what it is that's going on with it. So, the idea that this is going to spell the end of critical thinking or disruption from people is, I think,
creativity,
really,
yeah,
is a complete miss.
My kid loves Dali. He's 7, right? So he loves to. We work together, and I wanted to see how he would interact with it. And he started prompting This is the one that generates images, right? And he would say, "Okay, I want a ninja with the head of a broccoli," right? And then the AI will produce it, and he would laugh his butt, and then he would then change it and add it. So now we have a whole collection of vegetables looking like ninjas and warriors and firefighters, and that became his thing. His creative thinking is not broken; it's been empowered, like this bicycle for the mind, like Steve Jobs used to define computers. He's now not limited anymore by what the media creates for him. He can create his own media, and B, by his motor skills of a 7-year-old kid that doesn't know how to paint or use Adobe Illustrator, right? So suddenly he's been super empowered to be creative, not the opposite. And I think the same is true in many other areas. So for our professors listening to us today, your students can now produce not one essay, they can produce 100 of them as part of an exercise. I gave it to some of my students, and I gave them a specific case, and I told them to write me 3 essays in 3 different voices. One, that of a geopolitical analysis, another one from the point of view of an IR realism perspective, and then another from an IR idealism perspective,
Hmm.
right? And they
Hmm.
still have to come up with a core argument, and then ChatGPT would help them see how these different methodological or philosophical approaches would look differently from different points of view, right? So it is
Exactly.
not at all removing critical thinking; is giving you a new tool to express it, but that requires creativity by the faculty to change the way they test and experiment and teach, and that's scary.
It is. And I think, if you look at, just the way that we embrace these technologies is that you can look at them as an opportunity to do things more broadly, or to make yourself better, stronger, whatever it looks like, or we can be scared of them. And I think that, to take kind of like a very black and white view of all this. And the reality is, we vehicles are, the cars became the new horse and buggy. That's widely accepted that we use these types of vehicles, and now we're seeing gasoline becoming out of favor in a lot of ways, and we're going to see EVs and hydrogen vehicles and everything else. Things continue to shift, and kind of the one thing that close it out, like even like if you have disruption in the workplace, say that you're adding in a new technology, you're going to have people who get upset about it. Oh, it's going to take away from my job, it's going to do this, it's going to do that. And one or two things will happen. They'll either use it and they'll embrace it, or they'll end up leaving. And over time, what you start seeing in a workplace, for example, is nobody ever remembers the old way, because everything that's people who've come in are embraced, because this is how we do business. And I think that there's, even just from that little micro case study, is that you have the same thing with these types of technologies, whether it's going to be ChatGPT, which is going to change the paradigm in some ways of how we're going to operate in the classroom, or if it's going to be self-driving vehicles that may disrupt the entire shipping industry. It means that we have opportunities to re-look at how we're interacting with these technologies to embolden us to be better.
And so for faculty, but also for other areas, one of the things that we do as faculty, we're mentors, but also judges, right? We judge
Mm-hmm.
quality, and
Mm-hmm.
some of judges are base their work on a body of regulation that can be your rubric within your syllabus, the syllabus itself, or of course the law when you're talking about judges in the real sense of the word. So one of the things that we're seeing here, and this happens frequently with disruptive innovation, is that the regulatory model might not fit, right? So we are seeing challenges, for example, with the issue of what is plagiarism, right? So
Right.
can this be plagiarized if it's an AI that is creating it? We're seeing challenge of copyright. There's a bunch of lawsuits against a lot of the graphic generative AIs by
Mm-hmm.
artists that are complaining that their style it's being copied by this thing. And I mean, this is going to be an interesting conversation. I have my
Absolutely.
opinions and we could have
Right.
them, but I do think that it's important that we're seeing a creation of a new category where not only the work in itself is something that you copyright, not only the resemblance of it, but the flair or the style,
The
right?
style, right.
Yeah, and that's really weird, right? So we will have to be very careful as a society that we don't kill innovation in the name of intellectual property protection, right? So, but at the same time, we want to keep protecting the capacity of people to be creative. So there is a very interesting space right here, for example, for creative lawyers and creative legal scholars to look at this in a different way, and then for us as faculty in our classrooms to reconsider what we consider by authorship. I'll make a point, and it's something that I've discussed already with colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say that if we're going to say that it's dishonest to use, for example, a technology like GPT, well, I would say that it's even more dishonest to use a copy editor, which is something we have always allowed, or a writing coach, right?
Yeah.
Because at least in this case, it's only your human brain that is interacting with the computer to refine the quality of your words. Whereas when I send a student, which I do frequently, to the writing center of my university, it is a professional writer who cleans and helps them. Now, hopefully they learn something in the process, but
Right.
it's a different brain. It's another human.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, frankly, in many ways, ChatGPT gives you the opportunity of a student to bounce ideas basically with himself or herself with
Right.
this machine that teaches them how to do their job better. Right. So.
Right. And I think that's a great way of being able to kind of maybe close off this episode on disruptive innovation. But I think the overwhelming message here is, for me at least, is I think we have a responsibility as educators to guide our students to what they're going to experience in the workforce. I think that's one of the first and foremost things here. I know there's other responsibilities in research and publications and all these different things, and I totally appreciate that. But I think we can't lose the human touch of what we do in academia or as entrepreneurs, as innovators, as human beings, right? We're always creating. And we can look at the cycle of all of this throughout the course of human history and just see how much disruption there's been and how we see these seismic shifts and what the implications could be for us as a species. But the reality is these tools are not going anywhere. And, depending on what kind of legislative things may happen or what the universities decide, one thing I'll always stand behind is that if we look at prohibition at a very broad level, has prohibition been successful without authoritarianism? As academics, should we be authoritarians? I have a pretty strong feeling on that. The answer is no. That's not a responsibility to each other and to our students. So if we're not going to strong arm, which again, we shouldn't be, I don't think, then the option there is to embrace and to interpret.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we have this due diligence that's necessary.
I completely agree. I think that there are two core elements here that kind of coexist with each other. One is first the meta component, which is a very lean based approach to what OpenAI did, which is they got out of the building literally and gave the tool to everybody to see how everybody will use it. It'll gonna be interesting to see, for example, as they build their own business canvas, how they'll fund it, what are the cost structure. Right now, they literally have been raising funds just to put the tool on the hands of the people and see what they do, right? So It's a fantastic meta lesson of the stuff we teach in the Hacking for programs. Is they didn't go for an interview. They didn't say to people, hey, if you had a tool like this, how would you? No. They deployed it, have millions, very soon billions of users, and
very quickly.
They're getting incredible data, and they convince their founders and their funders, their seed capital, to allow them to get money to let people use this for free. Now, it's not going to be free forever, and we don't know what is going to be the computational price for it. A lot of the transcendence of the disruption is going to depend on how much this costs once you have to open your pocket, right?
Exactly.
So that's one element. The second, and this goes to your point about teaching the right tools. My kid is 6, I said. I wouldn't be happy if he went, when he goes to college, to a place where he is not given the most advanced tools in the name of a historical way of doing things. Most kids today know that by the time they are out of a 4-year program, half of the tools they were taught on the first semester are already obsolete anyway.
Absolutely.
So what we're looking for is to educate at the metacognition level. So be that ChatGPT of whatever Gizmo X happens in the future, they know how to integrate it fast, and the early bird gets the worm. We move faster. For the level of the United States of America and our near peer competitors, I want the most advanced innovations to happen here, not somewhere else. For our partners, right, partner nations, we want to help them so they do it with us, right? We want to do it together. For near peer competitors, we want to outsmart them always, right? And those are the challenges that we're trying to work. And ChatGPT is just a great example of this tectonic shift in technology acquisition and deployment that we are seeing.
No, and I think it's a fantastic way of being able to close out our time together today. So, Rodrigo, thank you again so much. Thank you for everybody tuning in, either via your favorite podcast streaming service or watching us online. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We'll be doing more of these and looking forward to a really fun second season and getting more involvement from our community and from some of our favorite colleagues. So,
for
Rodrigo,
those watching on YouTube, right? So if you can leave us on the comments section your impressions, your thoughts about this thing. For those professors using it, how are you using it? For those students, what has been your experience with it? Let us grow together and learn about this exciting new technology.
No, absolutely. That's great. So you'll find our links for contact communication in the description of these sessions, and we look forward again to seeing you at the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you so much.